Hello and welcome to another episode of the Student Garden Thought Leaders series. Today I'm super excited to be joined by Tracy Harris. Tracy, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Tracy, you've had an amazing career. I know you've obviously gone out on your own and you're doing some consulting work at the moment, but perhaps for our audience, if you could just tell us a little bit about, I suppose, your career and what you've kind of been up to over the last decade, because it's a pretty cool CV.
Great, thank you. Because I've been involved in the sector for just over 30 years, I won't take up too much time to go through the whole 30. But I think it's important to say where I started. When I was a uni student, I was doing my undergraduate degree, and I got a job in an independent learning centre in the English Language Centre at the University of Canberra, where I was actually studying. And my role at the time was to work with the students, mostly AusAid-sponsored students who were learning English, to just be a resource, to be there in the learning centre, to loan out back then cassette tapes for them to practice on and different books and that type of thing. And I found that I really enjoyed that work. I enjoyed working with those students. And so when an opportunity after I graduated came up to work for an independent, not-for-profit, the Canberra Council for International Students, I was the only employee. I was the admin officer for that, and we ran social welfare type activities for international students. And so that was my first full-time job in the sector.
Wow.
And I should say, so I was at the University of Canberra because I'm from Canberra, so Canberra born and bred. And when after I'd finished with the Canberra Council for International Students, I went to the University of Canberra to work for a period of time in student recruitment. So I have been one of those road warriors, one of the first ones on the road in China in particular, when you
doing
had the
road
masses,
shows,
doing road shows, carrying around 12-kilo bazooka, what we call the bazooka, which was the display system behind you. So I've done that. And then one of the fairly natural progressions if you work in Canberra is to join government. And so I joined the Department of Education in what was then called Australian Education International, or AEI, which is the international arm. And the international arm of the Department of Education still exists. They've just dropped the AEI branding. And so I did that for a period of time, working on policy, working on bilateral relationships, multilateral, looking at stakeholder engagement. So I was working with the sector as well, particularly the higher ed sector and the school sector. And then the government decided in 2000, or they made the announcement in 2009 that there would be a machinery of government change. So we call this a MOG. And if you've been MOG'd,
I've never heard of this. Okay,
any Canberra listeners or public service listeners who have been MOG'd before, where the government decides that a function that has been done by one government agency is going to move to another government agency. And that occurs through a machinery of government, a MOG. They decided that the marketing and promotion of Australian education and training internationally would move to Austrade, the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. And so because my role was marketing, was stakeholder engagement, running the market information package for stakeholders, I moved across to Austrade. And during that time, I got a diplomatic posting to Singapore, where I was the Trade and the ASEAN Education Commissioner and the Trade Commissioner to Singapore. I've got to say that was the best job that I've ever had and will ever had. It was an amazing time to be in ASEAN, where it was the 50th year of bilateral relations between Australia and Singapore.
So super active.
It was amazing. There was a lot of government interest. At the time, Myanmar was starting to look like it might open up, so there was activity there. I'm sad to see what's happened since then. Vietnam, Indonesia, so many opportunities. And then when I came back, I got a job with RMIT, and like 600 other colleagues at RMIT and people across the sector, during COVID, my role was made redundant. So I took a bit of a break from the education role only for about 8 or 9 months and did some work with Fire Rescue Victoria. And during that time, realised that that's not where my passion is. Emergency services, a very worthwhile area, but my passion is international education and education more broadly. It's bringing our experiences to international students and Australian students being able to go offshore. I am one of the believers, the true believers that believes that we are creating those social, diplomatic, security connections that are long lasting, and that's why the sector is so important.
Yeah.
And so then I got a job with Swinburne College as a general manager and dean, and I did that for a period of time. But I was doing some soul searching and decided that it really wasn't aligning with my values.
Yeah.
I wanted to work in a place that I could make more impact, where the students could be at the centre of what I was doing, rather than looking at the P&L every month. That's fine to be able to do that for some of it, but
totally.
I really wanted to make impact. And so I decided to chuck that role in and go out on my own for a period of time.
Oh, well, good on you.
Yeah, I've joked about it being a middle-aged gap year, but I'm taking a middle-aged gap year where I'm doing a portfolio approach to life, where
awesome.
I'm doing a little bit of study. I'm doing my Cert 4 TAE. I've hung up my shingle as Tracy Harris Solutions.
Yep.
And working with clients on just a variety of things where I've got a skill set. I'm on my own, so I'm not taking on major big projects, but working, particularly my experience, and especially having been in government, working in governance, compliance areas, but also the fact that I've been in international education for so long, that bringing just my experience with that to clients. And then the other thing that has been a great surprise to me actually is writing for the Koala News, and I'll do a plug, and I'm sure you'll do a plug, that if you're not yet subscribed to the Koala News, then you should be. This is a news outlet that was founded by Dirk Mulder in the middle of last year, and really it's become essential reading. Dirk's got contributors from a variety of different parts of the sector, and I think that we understand the sector, so when we're delving deep into what some of the current issues are, we're coming from it from that experience and expertise. We're not journalists, so we're not, that's not our expertise.
Yeah.
Our expertise is the sector, so we can unpack the issues, and that's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed doing that.
Well, yeah, we're big fans of the Koala News here at Student Garden, and the work you guys are doing, and just like the volume of content coming out of that publication is like very impressive. Obviously, with there being a lot of change happening around this at the moment, having publications like that to keep the industry informed is super critical. And with a track record like that, I'm sure you're getting plenty of phone calls from people shaking you down for consulting and to come and help on projects. When you look back kind of on your career, what are some of the things that stand out to you in terms of, key highlights? You mentioned obviously the students kind of being at the core of where your passion is. Would love to kind of hear some insights into, what are some of the experiences and the opportunities you've had? And second part of the question, would love to kind of know what it's been like to kind of go between education and government, and I suppose how you've been able to kind of leverage the experience you had in government and take that kind of into the higher education space.
So to answer your first question, the thing that came immediately to mind when you asked the question was one of the roles that I had in the Department of Education, where I was responsible for what was then called the Endeavour Awards. So this was a merit-based scholarship that the government actually put some money into having scholarships for both international and domestic students to undertake some kind of study, including mobility. And we were providing scholarships for people who wouldn't otherwise have had the money to come and study in Australia and have that student experience, and mostly from the Indo-Pacific, because that was where the government's focus. And now there's a network of alumni out there from the Endeavour Awards that had that opportunity. And then the other part to it was the outbound mobility. So we had scholarships for outbound. And when I was a uni student, I'm very Gen X. So at that time, my parents were going through the recession that we had to have, the Paul Keating recession. Mm-hmm. And the jobs were very few. And so you studied and you went on, you did your study in the shortest period of time, and then you went on to work. And so the idea of actually doing an outbound mobility experience didn't even cross my mind, didn't think about it. And when I got the opportunity to actually understand all of the different outbound mobility that is happening across the sector. And there's a lot. There's a lot that's unknown, and the universities are putting a lot of money in themselves, not just from government. What a great experience, because it's all very well to have international students coming here, but we also need our students to be going out and having the experience in the region that they then bring back here and have that appreciation. So that experience when I was doing that in government was one of the best things that I ever did.
I feel like when I hear about the outbound stuff, in the mainstream media or in the media in general, I only really hear about the Cambridges, the Harvards, the Stanfords, and I'm sure, I know there's a wealth of people obviously going to all types of universities, and as you say, that's really kind of being funded by obviously the industry, and government plays a big role in that as well. But perhaps we need to do make more of an effort to shine a light on kind of those experiences and what those people are kind of learning and kind of bringing back into obviously our society.
There's a government program called the New Colombo Plan. So unfortunately, the Endeavour Awards was defunded, which is a great shame. But one part of it that they did keep, the government kept, was what they now call the New Colombo Plan, that's run out of DFAT, and that's for domestic students to have an experience offshore. And that program is fantastic. It does both short-term and long-term mobility for students. There was a real worry when this current government got in that they might get rid of the New Colombo Plan, because there's a bit of a view that it's middle-class welfare. Yeah. We're paying for the middle classes to go and have a jaunt overseas. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, and I think that's partly because it's so embedded in the landscape now, which is terrific, that it's so important what it is doing and what the student experiences are. They're the experiences we need to make sure that are getting out there, that what students are actually gaining from it, because it is an issue within government to actually justify what's the outcome that we're getting out of this. It's hard to quantify, but there's some great research that is done every year under the auspices of the AUIDF, the Australian Universities International Directors Forum, that does a report on the outbound mobility, and you'd be quite surprised at how many students are actually travelling overseas.
Cool. And in terms of the second part of the question, government, universities, the two obviously sit side by side, but to have had so much experience working kind of within, well, first and foremost, in Canberra in a university, then in government. Yeah, how's that whole thing played out for you, I guess?
It's probably my biggest criticism of what is currently happening in the sector, to the sector, I should say, by the government and the various government agencies that are delivering policy, that there isn't enough on-the-ground experience that is informing what policy is being recommended to government. What I found coming in from a university, coming into government, when I first did it, I would have people say, we'll just get the universities to do that. And I would query, why would you think that they would want to? Or why do you think they've got the expertise or the capacity to do that? And currently, with some of the announcements that have been made, I just think that whoever is advising government, there is just not enough experience of understanding what happens on the ground within a university. And that's the thing that I think people from the sector can bring. I even read something that Andrew Norton wrote fairly recently about the new ATEC, the Australian Tertiary Education Commission. Even he was saying that there's not enough sector expertise that is happening to inform government about how that's going to be brought together. Vice versa, it's also the same. Coming in from government to a university environment, I definitely could see where universities can benefit from how government operates, particularly around the governance and compliance area. I mean, you might think that the sector is over-regulated, and there's certainly a lot of regulation, but I think that the sector could be smarter in terms of how it does that, using some of the I guess, tools that government uses in how they regulate and what the compliance looks like. So there's the mobility. If there's more mobility between the two, I think that there would be a greater understanding about, this is how it actually happens. One of the questions that I'm being asked at the moment by a lot of people is, why is government doing what it's doing? Why don't they understand the detriment that's going to because to the sector and the amount of money that's going to come out of the sector because of this crunching, the enrolment caps, all of the other things that they're doing. And my answer to them is that you have to actually understand the politics of it. So the government is weighing up the benefit of crunching down the sector so that it can respond to the domestic narrative of, we're doing something about accommodation shortages, we're bringing down cost of living, we're going to use the money from our student visa hike to pay for the Universities Accord for domestic students. They're weighing that up with there's a $48 billion industry that we're cutting the heart out of essentially, but what's going to be more benefit to us? And I think that's the thing that people are having a lot of trouble grappling with, because if you've never been in government, you're not understanding that actually that's what they're doing. They're desperate not to be a one-term government. And we've got to get through the election next year, and so we need to crunch the sector down.
And, when obviously that's kind of the topic of conversation right now, the international caps, and rightly so, given the likely impact it's going to have on the industry. What do you kind of see when you look into the future, and how is this going to kind of change the industry and the landscape, do you think?
If we assume that they're not going to walk back the caps, that this is going to go ahead, my view is that I've discussed it, I've called it the pendulum, and I think Phil Honeywood's also called it the pendulum. They're going to swing the policy pendulum too far, and it's going to have a massive impact. There are going to be job losses for sure, and I think and massive money lost out of the sector. Then the government will realise that, I think partly they'll go, tick, we did that, that's good. But oops, we've maybe pushed a little bit too far, or tick, we've done it and we've been re-elected. Now let's pull some of the levers back to lighten them a little bit more. The worry, of course, is that once you've done the damage, the rebuild takes years, and people come out of the sector. A really good example of that is COVID to the ELICOS sector. A lot of English language teachers left the industry during that time, and they haven't necessarily returned, even though the numbers were starting to grow. It was really difficult to get ELICOS teachers. The same thing's going to happen. People are going to leave and they're going to get jobs somewhere else. The ramping back up of trying to get students back in once government, just takes those levers, lessens the levers, that is going to be the challenge. I think again, there's a naivety in government that they think that they can just turn the tap on and off.
Totally.
And students can go anywhere else.
And I think maybe that naivety comes from the experience with COVID, where that was sort of how it went. And I guess from an infrastructure point of view, at that time there were a whole bunch of there was policy in place like Job Seeker and JobKeeper to, I suppose, keep those people from, at least, being able to pay the bills and feed themselves and continue to live in their homes. And then they were, able to kind of rejoin the industry. So perhaps some of the naivety comes from the experience of COVID and the way, I guess, the industry was able to bounce back so quickly. But I think, obviously it's very different to when it was then. That's
right, because the doors were closed for other places as well. Whereas at the moment,
yes, true.
To be fair, there's some of our competitors are actually, limiting the number of students that they've got. But when you've got even Donald Trump coming out saying he's welcoming international students and they might even get a green card. The US it's one of our biggest, or he's the biggest competitor. Students will just go elsewhere, and there is that naivety that they'll just come back to Australia once we want them back.
And what have you kind of seen as the kind of big appeal, I suppose, in terms of we step back a little bit. Obviously we've had such a thriving, international student market. What is it from that you've kind of seen over the years being in the industry? What do you think it is that has made Australia so appealing for those people to kind of come and, get educated and often stay and, be a part of our society?
I think that we run the narrative that it's the quality education.
Yeah.
And I actually think that that's not true.
Yeah.
I think that that's part of it, but I actually think it's the whole package. And this is probably one of the issues that I have with the government saying that transnational education is an alternative to having students onshore. All that you're going to get there is the curriculum.
Totally.
And sometimes you might get the Australian
And the
teacher
logo.
and the logo,
Yeah.
but you're getting the curriculum. You're not getting the Australian student experience.
Yeah.
So the package is what is attractive. It is hopefully we are delivering quality education, although I think that there's a debate to be had about some places.
Yeah.
You get to live in Australia, and I'm from Canberra and I love Canberra even, and I know it gets knocked by places. There's some fantastic places to live here. We do put measures in place for students to be able to work, and that is attractive where the cost of living is expensive. So we need to be able to give students the opportunity to support themselves. They can get work experience. There's more and more work experience being put in. That's not perfect though. So I'm highlighting, you asked me what are the positives, and I think these are some of the positives. And then we shouldn't ever forget that this has been, so the full fee paying part of the sector has been in for 30 something years. My maths is not very good. Over 30 years. But before that, we also had the old Colombo plan. Like, we have a very long history of people who have studied here. That word of mouth is, I mean, you can spend as much money as you like on an ad, but word of mouth, my background's marketing as well. So the client or the customer that you keep is the customer that is much cheaper than trying to get the new one. So if you also split them out at the other end and they're doing word of mouth promotion for you, then that's, I think, where we've also benefited.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, talking to students here in Australia, it's the community, it's everything that kind of sits around the qualification. As you say, obviously the education's really important, and, there's an end goal they have in mind, whether it's the job, whether, a career, whether it's the education itself. But certainly it's that experience that seems to be the big thing that attracts people to Australia.
And having met a number of teachers, and when I was with Swinburne College, that was one of my roles, was to, we had just over 100 different teachers that were on our books. They are so passionate about what they do.
Yeah.
They really take care of the students. They cared about what the experience they were giving to students. And I think that is in the main across the board, that teachers, so who are the ones that really are the ones we need to thank in the student experience? It's the teachers. It's not administrators like me sitting behind a desk, pushing the papers around and deciding what's going to happen here or there. It's the person that's in the classroom, and they care. They're not doing it for the money, because there's a lot of money in it. They actually really love what they do, and they're very caring for their students, and they want the best for the student.
Yeah. You're obviously talking to a ton of, leaders across the higher education space, and, through the Koala News, you're also, talking to a lot of influencers across the market. What are some of the kind of focuses looking forward, and what are people, we put kind of the international camps to one side, and I know that's quite hard to do, but what are the things outside of that the sector's really kind of focused on, whether it's, from an international context or a domestic context?
It's kind of hard, I think, right now for the sector to, I feel like it's a bit hamstrung.
Yeah.
That it's really waiting to see what is going to come out of government to know what else it can do next. Now, that doesn't mean that nobody's doing anything. There are institutions that are looking at transnational education opportunities, but it's a fallacy to think that there are that many opportunities out there that can replace the students that are coming in. You need to look at new courses, what's coming in after courses that aren't as popular need to be retired out. So, I think there's probably two parts to what's happening in the sector. There's the part that operationally just needs to keep travelling along like it's doing. You need to still keep recruiting students, because you don't know what your cap's going to be, so we need to still keep doing that. We need to be thinking about improvements to our curriculum, what are new opportunities, diversifying the market, although even that's a little bit wary. You've got to be a bit wary of that, because
how's that going to play out with the caps? Yeah,
exactly. And not just the caps, but also, and having come from Austrade, one of the things that we used to say was, Austrade was turning on the tap, and then Department of Home Affairs had turned the tap off, because we were doing some stuff in Africa at the time, you start to generate interest from Africa, but Department of Home Affairs doesn't want anybody from Africa.
Yeah, right.
So what's the point of doing that? So you've got to even be a little bit wary around that.
You sort of touched on T&E, and again, I know there's a lot of commentary around T&E at the moment. What's kind of your view, I suppose, on the model? And some universities have been doing it for a long time. It seems like a lot of people are sort of experimenting and looking to kind of get into the space, whether it's in Asia or whether it's in India. What's kind of your perspective, I suppose, on the model and sort of the place that it kind of has in the ecosystem?
So I think it does have a place. So I want to make that clear that I'm not negative, totally against T&E. I think it is part of an internationalisation strategy for some providers. Some providers are just not going to be able to play in this space. So let's say there are some providers that, yes, T&E is a good thing. But when we talk about the model, it's modules. There's a number of different models that are playing out in transnational education. The government seems to focus on branch campuses. That's the thing that they highlight as being the model. But actually, when you've got RMIT Vietnam over 25 years, that's and Swinburne the same 25 years in Malaysia. Those conditions that existed back then don't exist now. So if those full campuses where you're offering a full suite of courses, that environment where you are making a profit, now, that profit didn't happen for years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even on some of them, the profit is not that high.
Yeah.
RMIT is a good example. I was just looking at their annual report for last year. They are making money out of RMIT Vietnam now. None of that gets repatriated back to Australia. It's all in Vietnam and recycled in Vietnam, which is great for the Vietnamese.
Totally.
But then you have to question, what's core business for us if I'm a university? What's my core business? What's my opportunity cost if I go into transnational? And then what's my return on my investment? And that's, I think, where the government seems to get lost, that most of the biggest models out there are where you're either franchising, so somebody else is teaching your course, so you're not making huge amounts of money there. You've got a partnership. Well, the partner actually wants to make some money in this as well, not just you. Yeah. Or you've got the branch campus. Well, even the new branch campuses that have been launched that, again, are getting lots of publicity from the government, they're rah-rahing them. They're a small number of courses. Deakin, I think I was counting as 4 or 5 courses, maybe even less to start with. Monash, Indonesia, has got 8 courses and a PhD, 8 masters and a PhD. They're not even in the bachelor space, not going to want to be in that space. So it's niche. It does add to your Deakin, for example, in India, where it's had such a long history. I think it's over 35 years in India. If the government comes knocking on your door and says, we want you to be operating in India, you don't say no. Yeah. And I'm assuming that's what would have happened in getting them into India. But they're not offering a plethora of courses. It's not a full suite.
Yeah, it's interesting the point you make. It's about the financial viability of these partnerships, and ultimately they are businesses at the end of the day. And it's like back to the really good point you make around what's core. And I think that kind of coupled with the fact that education is becoming more accessible for people in these markets, whereas you go back 30 years ago, it was a very different environment. If you're trying to, get a good quality education in Vietnam locally, there weren't as many options as you look today. Obviously, those countries have worked really hard to lift the standards of their own education. So that's obviously impacting it as well.
That's right. So they've improved their own capacity. Back in those days, 20, 30 years ago, particularly in our region, governments of the time were providing opportunities for foreign providers to come in. Well, they're not doing that now in the main. So you've got some of the stuff that's happening in India. Time will tell on how that's going to go with the gift city that they've set up. Yep. Because I think people get excited by the numbers. There's how many millions of people.
Like Indonesia, for example, right?
Exactly, And even I think India, Modi came out and said, we've got X number of millions of people that we need to educate. And so our government sees dollar signs and thinks, well, we could have a bit of that. but actually it's incredibly difficult, and it's even more difficult for the vet sector. So I've really focused on higher ed.
Yeah, well, true.
But even harder for the vet sector to make money in, and that there aren't a huge number of really good examples of the vet sector being able to operate offshore and actually make a go of it.
There's been some pretty significant changes for onshore international students recently as well, obviously with visa changes. Do you think you could, just help us to understand, because it's very convoluted when we hear about visa hopping, and if you could kind of just help us to understand and explain the actual changes and then sort of the impact that it's going to have, because we're talking, I guess it's to your point before, it's the vet sector, it's the higher ed sector, and just what's kind of happening with the changes for onshore students as well. Onshore international, sorry.
Sure, and I won't go into all of the different pieces because we'll be here for another couple of hours. In a nutshell, the government wants to reduce the number of people that are here, so the net overseas migration figure. And so how are we going to do that? Let me take a step back. Yep. There's two, as I see it, the Tracy Harris view of the world, there's two parallel things happening here. The first is that we, the government, want to reduce net overseas migration. And one of our big issues is international students, according to the government. Yep. And some of it is absolutely of the government's making, where during the pandemic we were letting them change visas so that they could stay and work because we wanted them then. And the current government then taking too long to walk those measures back. So what's one way that we can, of all the different parts of net overseas migration that we actually can have an impact on, it's international students. So how do we squeeze those numbers down? And so we do that by announcing that students can't change visa once they're onshore. We are going to limit the graduate visa. Once you're on the visa, there's a limit because we opened up how many years you could have.
And you could switch jobs, right?
You could switch jobs. You could stay longer, so they increased the amount of years that you could stay based on what level of qualification you had. Let's pull that back. So that's one way of doing it. Alongside that, there has been a terrible lack of transparency in some of the decisions that are being made offshore for students wanting to apply to come onshore. So back in the dim dark ages when I was in student recruitment, you could meet a student, you knew what the visa requirements were, and you could meet the student and you could go through, follow the bouncy ball. If you meet all these criteria, you're going to get your student visa. There's such a lack of transparency at the moment where students are having their visas rejected, and then somebody with a very similar, agents are reporting, somebody with a very similar background, that they get in. So there's a lack of transparency there. So the number of visa grants has been decreased as well. So that's been happening on one side. Let's crunch down the number of students that we have, and this is all tied with cost of living. We want to be re-elected next year. Cost of living, accommodation. There's that narrative. Then the other side, the parallel track that's happening, is the quality and integrity track. The quality integrity is where the language of the government. The new ESOS amendment bill was around quality and integrity. So there has been, and the sector has known, that there are bad actors in the sector. And I'm talking about students that aren't genuine students, that are here for other reasons, providers that have not done the right thing, and this is the way it's been for as long as I can remember. I was around during the cooks and hairdressers back in those days. That there are bad actors, but they are. It sounds like there's far more of those than there actually are.
Right? Yeah.
But the government is responding to a lot of the, I can't remember which publication did the feature on the ghost colleges. I think maybe it was AFR or one of those. So we want to have a quality sector. So let's make sure that we can put some measures into place to do that. And this is where the narrative of the enrolment caps comes in. Of this is actually going to help the sector by having enrolment caps. Look, the reason behind it is that if you've got more than 50% of your student cohort are international students, then therefore the quality of the education is poor. Now that I don't see the cause and effect of that. If you are a private college, for example, that is just set up for international students, then you're 100% international students. That doesn't mean your education quality is poor. It could be fantastic, especially if you've got good student support happening. You're doing other activities with them. But the government has got this perception that we've got too many international students in classrooms and then both domestic and international students aren't getting a quality experience. So you put those two things in that are happening in parallel together, and then you get what is happening in the sector. I mean, even the latest announcement this week where visas have increased by 125% to $1,600, and the government tried to say, well, this is going to improve the quality of the sector. No, it's not. They did blatantly domestically, and they're quite happy to say this is going to contribute to implementing the Universities Accord for domestic students. I mean, I said to somebody, why didn't they just lie? Why didn't they just say this is going to help everybody? But no, and the reason is because we've got to get to the domestic voter and let them know that this is what we're doing to help our domestic students. And
well, I appreciate you making sense of the whole thing, because I feel like I've got
I'm not sure if I did
like
it.
I've got a whole bit of grasp of it after hearing you talk about it for a couple of minutes. So thank you for that. Final question for you. I suppose when you look out into, say we've got our crystal ball here on the table, you look out across the next decade, what are some of the kind of trends you think are going to emerge or continue to gain momentum, both here, domestically, but also from an international higher education perspective?
I think that global mobility will always continue. I think it even happened during the pandemic, maybe not into Australia, but across the globe it still happened. And it's so important. We want global mobility to occur. We want our students to go out. We want international students to come in across the globe. So I think that will continue. And even if the government swings the pendulum too far, and if you look at the disruptions that have happened in the sector does recover. It maybe won't recover as quickly or as high level. The sector's still going to exist. I think some providers will go out of the market. That there is going to be a smaller number of providers. How many? I'm not good enough in the numbers to be able to tell you. So then in 10 years, do we see more providers coming back in? Probably not, because if we look at the Australian demographic, that's going to be an issue. And again, on that migration figure, what happens domestically with migration is going to influence that a lot. But I believe that the international education sector will continue, because it must. We can't become insular, where we need to have perspective, voices, relationships with other countries. So then what else might happen? We might see a growth of, the government does bang on about diversity all the time. It's not as easy as that. But we might see some more diversity in the market, where we might see some new markets coming into Australia, but they're not going to come in the India or China numbers, because those markets don't exist. But, a little bit more in diversity. What I hope doesn't happen is what is being floated, that we have international students, we force them to come in to do courses because we want the skill set. I think we've got to be very wary about that, because that can change. And we've seen it happen. And so from an optimistic point of view, one of the things that I actually hope will happen is that the government will put some more effort into to international student graduates being able to get a job in productive jobs, not in the gig economy, delivering our meals on a Saturday night, but actually in the field that they have done their degree in or their course in, and that they can actually be contributing to the Australian lifestyle economy, be part of it. So I hope that that's something that the government could put some energy into, rather than at the funnel end of pushing students into courses, that when they get spat out at the other end, they still can't get a job.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, if someone's willing to, you know, move to the other side of the world to get their education, they're generally pretty motivated to move into a, you know, into a highly productive role. And, you know, from my own experience and working with, you know, second generation, third generation, you know, migrants to this country, first generation migrants, like, you know, the amount of just, not just diversity in terms of their backgrounds, their ideas, but just kind of their lust for wanting to, you know, be a part of the company and really like throw everything they've got at it, because, you know, often they've come from the other side of the world or their families have come from the other side of the world, and to them, you know, having a great education, getting a strong career that helps them, enables them to support their families is what kind of drives them. So I agree with you. I hope that happens.
And if you've done your degree here or a course here, and you've had that experience already, that you understand what the Australian lifestyle is like, the community is like. You can make the choice that this is actually where I want to be. So I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have migrants just come from overseas directly to migrate because they meet the conditions for migration. But our international students are already here.
Yep.
And they've lived here for a period of time. They've started to establish ties. So aren't they the kind of people that we want to stay here? At the same time, I think the other thing we should remember is that actually the vast majority go home.
Yeah.
They come, they get their education, they have the experience. Hopefully they take home really fond memories of having studied here, and they take what they've learnt to contribute back to their own country and to contribute to the economic prosperity of their country. And that is something we can't lose sight of, that this is my point about forcing students to do a course that they don't really want to do. Yeah. They should be able to do what they want to do, that they can take home to their own country, that's going to be good for their own country.
Absolutely. Well, Tracy, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on the podcast today. I've learned a whole bunch of stuff. I'm sure those listening will have as well. For those wanting to get in touch with you, is LinkedIn the best place to contact you?
Yes, and it's Tracy with no E. Everybody, finds it hard to find me. They put the E in. So Tracy with no E, Tracy Harris Solutions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, George.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks for having me.